Well, hello everybody, and welcome. You're in the right place if you're here to see FusionReactor Hidden Gems in FusionReactor 6. And sorry, I just got distracted for a moment because somebody said they couldn't see the chat pod. Would anybody else say they can't see the chat pod? I don't think there's. Darn it. I don't see anything that I have that controls that. That's unfortunate. All right. So sorry about that. So you don't see the chat pod. I'll have to look into that later, but let's move on. So certainly if you guys, by the way, the questions, you say only questions appears, someone saying they only see an option to enter questions. And to be clear, you guys don't see the questions that people are raising. You don't see each other's questions that you're raising, right? You just see the opportunity to put in questions, right? And that's very good. Okay, so thanks for that. Now I see someone said I do see it, but I can't believe that everybody but one person would see the ability to enter chats. We'll let it go. Just you can use the questions pod to talk to me. Let's leave it at that. In fact, you know what? In the interest of time, I'm going to stop this recording and for that. Alrighty, hello everybody. You're in the right place if you're here to see Hidden Gems in FusionReactor 6. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And let's go ahead and get started. So as I say here, I hope you'll learn a ton. We're going to uncover hidden gems in FusionReactor 6. Some of them will be things that maybe you've heard about but haven't fully understood. I'll give you some tips about some of the more popular things, but I'll also talk about some things that are a little less obvious. And I want to clarify that we have another talk, some of you have seen it, called Hidden Gems in FusionReactor. That's about those that are gems that are not new to 6, but they're hidden gems nonetheless, whether you're using 6 or 5. They may apply to you. So that's a separate talk. So there's one about what's new in 6 and hidden gems in 6, only in 6, and then there's another that's more generic. And you'll want to check that out if you haven't seen it. We'll be offering that next month, I suspect. And to clarify, this is not all that's new in FusionReactor 6. I'm not going to go over in detail everything that's new. We just don't have time. It would take too much time. So we'll just briefly cover some of the major new things, and then we'll move on to some of the things that are less obvious. Okay. And the session is being recorded, and everybody that's registered will get a link to that recording as well as these slides that you're looking at. So you don't have to worry if you see something on the screen, you don't have to worry about writing down the details. You'll get the slide shortly and you'll have what you need. All right, so let's start though with a couple of quick polls, just so I can understand where you guys are coming from. So first, how often do you use FusionReactor? Just to give me a sense of where you're coming from in your use of FusionReactor. And I'll give you about 10 seconds to fill that in. And the numbers are coming in about the order that they were listed. So most use it daily, constantly, about the same, use it weekly, occasionally. Some use it only monthly, and some use it only rarely. And Vishnu, who wrote in his answer in the questions, that's not what I'm looking for. You should see a poll on screen that you can click the button instead. All right, well, let's move on. So thank you for that. Next, what's the latest version of FusionReactor that you use? And actually, I need to update that because it says the latest is 6.2.2. That was when I first gave this. We're now to 6.2.4. So assume that that's at 6.2.4. Make a note. Okay, and it's nearly, the majority are using the latest. Great to see, and then about 20% are using version 6 and about 25% are using version 5. Understandable. So some people do come to this talk even though it's about 6 and they're still only using 5, and that's fine. I want them to learn about what's new. I mean, again, it's not really a what's new, so you shouldn't view it as the what's new presentation, but you will definitely learn about what's new, so that's fine. Okay, thanks for all the answers. And then finally, just out of curiosity, what major features of FusionReactor do you find that you use regularly? The main UI, and this is multiple choice, so you can pick more than one. The main UI, the enterprise dashboard, stack traces, ECP email alerts, the logs. And again, they're coming in about the order that they're listed, although good to see that there's a larger number using the logs. Great to see that. Okay, good. That's good enough answers. Thank you very much, everybody. So cool. Appreciate that. All right, let's move on. So just before we get started about what's new in 6, since maybe some of you haven't been to the previous webinar, I just want to remind you of a couple key points. First, FusionReactor can be used with any CFML engine. Maybe most of you are using ColdFusion. That's okay. Even if you're not using ColdFusion, if you're using Lucy or Rilo or Blue Dragon, you can use ColdFusion with any, or sorry, FusionReactor with any of those engines. And then furthermore, you can use it with any Java application or server. So whether you're using, say, Tomcat or JBoss, Wildfly, Jetty, WebSphere, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I say any application, so I mean any Java application, especially ones that are web-oriented, Solar, Confluence, these are all Elasticsearch, these are all things that are web-based applications built in Java. Yeah, you can use FusionReactor to monitor those as well. And the key point is that it's a low-cost, low-impact, and reliable tool, so it's meant to be used for production, as we'll talk about today. And it's been trusted for over 10 years by thousands of companies and 30,000 server implementations worldwide. And just quickly about myself, I'm an independent consultant. I don't work for Integral, the makers of FusionReactor, but I work with them. I'm a big fan of them. And I spend my days focused on CF Server, troubleshooting primarily, sometimes also Rilo, Lucy, Blue Dragon, and other Java servers. And I do my own consulting for the past 10 years at careheart.org, just sending information, helping people with problems throughout the day, pretty much every day, all day. And I also do consulting for Integral, through Integral. They get consulting. People sign up at cfconsultant.com. That's their website. And then often those consulting engagements are passed to me. So again, I work with FusionReactor every day. And I also do the FusionReactor training and occasionally even assist with FusionReactor support. But they have great engineers, and by far they handle most things, and I just basically am an evangelist for them. Happy to do it. All right, let's move on. So there's a couple of key new features that we'll introduce but really won't detail here. There's other resources that get into those, including videos that get into these in more detail. And I'll also say that these two first things are only offered in what's called the Ultimate Edition. That's new in FusionReactor 6. And so that's above Enterprise, called Ultimate. And that's the production profiler and the production debugger. So these are two major new features in FusionReactor 6, and I could spend a whole hour on either one or certainly on both of them. So anyway, we won't do that. We'll just quickly introduce them so that you know about them. So first is the production profiler. That's a low overhead production profiler. And I make that distinction because most people, when they think of a Java profiler, they think of something that's going to be pretty intensive and have high overhead and high impact. And they may think, I'm not going to use that in my server. But the FusionReactor profiler is intended to be used in production. And the key is it lets you see where most of the time is being spent within any given request. And the way I like to demonstrate that by example is, let me go and look at a demonstration. Now, I'm going to do demos sometimes on my own website, careheart.org's FusionReactor, and no, you can't see it, only I can. And then also, sometimes I'll show you demo.fusion-reactor.com. Now, that is a site you can go to, any of you, if you want to, especially you who are not using FusionReactor 6 yet, you can play with FusionReactor 6 for free. Just go to demo.fusion-reactor.com and you'll be able to log into it and see this. Now, I will say that this version, the demo, doesn't have all the features. It's in a rather limited mode, so you won't be able to turn on the debugger. You won't be able to do the profiler. So I won't be doing everything as demos there. But here on my website, here I am running FusionReactor 6, and there you can see the profiler button there and the debug button. And again, if you are on FusionReactor 6 at your work environment looking at this with me, and you don't see these, it's because you're on the standard edition of FusionReactor or the Enterprise edition, and those don't include the profiler and debugger. The Ultimate edition includes these. But anyway, what I wanted to show is I'm going to kick off a request that's going to take a long time. Give me just a moment to log in. Okay, now normally if we had a long-running request running in FusionReactor, we would see first that it'll show up. Hopefully you guys are all familiar with these basics of FusionReactor. There is a single run, in my case, one request running, taking a long time. It's now up to 12 seconds. And I could go to request activity and I could do a stack trace and say, hey, what are you doing right now? And sometimes I'll be able to tell by looking at it, hey, this is what it was doing. And that's another subject, really not the place here to get into that. But stack traces are great. But first of all, they only tell you what's going on at that moment in time. You don't know whether what it was doing at that moment it was doing for a long time. And I'm backing up now and it's finished. I'd set it to run for 20 seconds and it's not there anymore. The other thing is that you have to be here to do the stack trace. Now, if you turn on the crash protection alert emails, which I'm a big fan of, and again, pretty fundamental stuff, those emails will send you the stack trace at a point in time. But again, it's just a point in time. You still don't know what was that request doing for the duration of its time. Well, this is where the profiler is so powerful. The profiler is a new feature in FusionReactor 6 Ultimate, and we can see it from the history. If the request that we're looking for is still in the history, there is this request still in the history. Sometimes you guys will have so many requests running that if you look at the history, something you ran even 10 seconds ago is gone. So if it was long running, you might look at longest request, but that's the 100 longest since ColdFusion or whatever CFML engine or Java engine came up. I like slow requests. That's the most recent requests that were slow, and sure enough, here is that recent slow request, and I just want you to see that there's an option there that says profiler, or on any of the pages where I view it, if I were to go into the details of the request, and I've clicked that link and I'm waiting for it to come up. I know it shows like it's not updating. I don't know what's going on. I'm going to try this one more time. This is just some issue with either my server or the network or my browser, but usually you guys all know that when you click on a link, you're taken right to the details. But the point is, here's that request. It took 20 seconds, and I want you to see there's a link to Profiler, and there's a link to Profiler. So the Profiler is available in many ways, but here's the point. However we look at it, it's all the same. The Profiler says, okay, for that request, where did it spend its most time? Where did it spend its most time? Now, in my case, that was a request that did a CF document that went to sleep for 20 seconds, and I literally called the ColdFusion sleep function to sleep for 20 seconds, and we can see here that 100% of the time was in that page and 95% of the time was in that sleep method. And you can literally see here 95% of the time. And you might say, well, and I'll tell you, I'd set it to run for 20 seconds. You might say, well, why doesn't this add up to 20 seconds? Well, the profiler doesn't look at everything that's going on all the time. By default, it looks at a request once it's been running, listen, once it's been running for more than 3 seconds, then by default it starts sampling every 200 milliseconds. What are you doing? 200 milliseconds later, what are you doing? 200 milliseconds later, what are you doing? So it's all very quick. It's literally taking stack traces internally, very fast and quick and low overhead, and then it tells us how much time did it observe it running. So, you know, after 3 seconds and at 200 millisecond intervals, it tracked about 17 seconds worth of time. And if I scroll up, we can see that it did 83 samples. And in those 83 samples during that 20-second request, it tracked a total of just under 17 seconds. And more importantly, and this is the more important part, is it says where was the time spent by percentage. And we can see that 95% of the time was in that sleep method. Now, your examples are going to look different, and I'll leave you to explore this on your own and look into the resource and the documentation. But the point is, this is so different than a stack trace, which was just a point in time. This is over the life of that request. Pretty cool. Profiler is a very powerful feature. Okay. And again, for anybody that came in late, these slides, which have these details on them, you will get sent the slides by email after the presentation, and you'll also get a link to the recording. So all of this is being recorded, and you'll get the slides as well. So if you want to learn more about the profiler, you can go to this URL, which talks about it, this URL, which introduced it, and this URL that is the documentation for it. So go check those things out. Definitely want to learn more about using the profiler. All right, moving on. The second major new feature was the production debugger, And again, this may sound like an oxymoron, a debugger in production. And so let's just back up and clarify what we mean by a debugger. Some folks have been using them for years. Some folks have never used one at all. So a debugger would traditionally be something you run from within some development environment, And in that development environment, you would run a request and set a breakpoint, and when it reached that point, it would stop, and you could step through the code line by line, watching the lines of code executing, looking at the values of variables. Well, that's what the debugger is. Yes, the FusionReactor debugger is a way to set breakpoints, stop on a line of code, watch it step through the codes, and look at variables, and even set variables. Now, you might say, well, I would never want to do that in production. Well, the whole point is it's a production debugger. It's designed in ways that are patent pending that make it safe to use in production. We'll spend just a moment on those, but really this, again, is worthy of its own talk. And I do have recordings and videos that I've done, and I'll give you links to those. So this will be a quick overview. So it does let you step through code and view and even change variables, and the demos will show you that. I don't have time to get into all that demo. But here's another key point, is that there is no IDE set up. This is all done through FusionReactor's web-based interface. You don't need ColdFusion Builder. You don't even need to use it with ColdFusion. You can use it with other things. So just want to clarify, you can use it with Lucy, which of course doesn't interact with ColdFusion Builder. There is no IDE required. This is all done through the web interface. And again, it's totally safe for production use. And you might say, in fact, let me just back up before we go into that. Let me just do a quick demo of it. So here on my website, if I come over here to the debug icon, under the debug icon I have breakpoints. And just like in any debugger, you can set up a breakpoint by clicking a link and going through a screen and saying what line of code do you want to, what file and what line of code do you want to stop. And you can set conditions and say, I only want to stop if it's on line X and condition Y is true. And the condition can be pure CFML condition. So you could say if a variable is equal to a value, or a variable contains a value, or a struct, or CFC method return, or whatever. You can put anything in here that would be a valid condition. Now, down here is where things start to get powerful with regard to why it's safe to use in production. Normally, a debugger would just have these things and only these things, but the FusionReactor debugger also lets you say, should I intercept a request or fire the breakpoint on every request that happens, or only a certain number of times? And I'll show you in a moment. I've set it up to fire only once, and you'll see what the implication of that is. So you can control how often it gets set up. You can also control what it does, and by default, it will pause the request and let us stop and look at it, but we can also do other things like sending an email. I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. And when it does pause, you can set how long it pauses, and I'll show you the implications of that. And then you can also set, do you want it to intercept every request or only one request at a time, which if you only set it for one, this wouldn't matter. But if you had set the fire count for more than one, you could say, do you only want to intercept one at a time if you're going to intercept it. So those are all among the features you can do, and I'll just show you I already have a breakpoint set up, and I can edit that breakpoint, and it's set to look at this line of code, this line in this template, okay? And I don't have any condition, but I do have it set to fire only once. So let me turn it on, because it's been turned off. I'd had it set to fire once. It had already fired once. I'm going to turn it on. That'll reset that. So now it's set to fire only once, and it has not yet fired. And I'm going to go to a page that demonstrates this. So I'm going to, right here on this page, when I click this link, actually, let me show you first if I don't have it enabled. If I don't have it enabled, and I run this request, you'll see what happens is I get a divide by zero error. Divide by zero error. The request did run, but it got an error. Well, I'm going to back up, and I go turn on the debugger, and now I'm going to run it. Just refreshing that request. And watch, it's not running. It's spinning up here. It says connecting, and it's spinning. And down here it says waiting in the bottom left corner. So the request has been made, but the debugger has intercepted that request. And in FusionReactor, I see an icon that says, hey, there's a debugging request waiting for you to look at. When I click on it, it shows me that request having been intercepted at that line of code, and I can do stuff. And I've got, remember, I had 60 seconds to respond. I've still got 30 seconds left to respond, and that's to begin debugging it. Once I start debugging it, that clock turns off. So I'm going to click on this and check it out. I'm stepping now into the code. I can see the CFML, and of course you can only see this if you can get into FusionReactor, and you have to have a valid username and password to get in. But the point is, I can see this now, and I can step through the code. I'm here on line 1, and I could step through the code There's a step over button, and this will go to line 4. And line 4 would do a CF include that would do whatever it does in init.cfm, and I could step into that if I wanted to, but I also could just say step over means do it, do whatever you do, and keep going. And if I look at variables, we'll see that a variable got set called sumVar to some value. That was done in init.cfm. I didn't see it get done, it just got done. Now similarly, here's a method of a CFC being called, and I could just step over it, but instead I'm going to step into it. I want you to see how powerful this is. When I say step into it, it's not only going to run that code, but it's going to show me that. It finds the CFC, and it takes me to the method of the CFC and sits there waiting to run that line of code. Okay, so that's what the debugger is about. And I could step through the code one at a time, step over, or if I was done looking at this method, I could also say step out. That means leave whatever I was doing and go back to whatever called me. And I get back to this, and I'm ready to proceed, and I'll step over to the next line of code. And we see we're about to set a variable called x. And when I look at variables, there's the x having been set, and it was set to 0. And that's why if I run this code, 2 divided by 0 gets an error. Well, another thing you can do in the debugger is you can change this. I'll say make it 1, and you can, just click on it and it sets it, or you can also click on the CF set button and change things up there that way. And having changed it, I can now proceed either to step over the line of code or run the whole template. I'll just go ahead and step over the line of code. And we see that we didn't get an error. It did proceed to the next line, and it is about to output that. And I know this is a simple template, but I'm just trying to demonstrate the point. And you can do this with CF script as well. But the point is, it's working. I overrode that variable, and now there won't be an error. And in fact, if I say just proceed to conclusion, we'll see this connecting finally finishes. If I look at the page, it said 2 divided by 1 is equal to 2, and we did debug it. And that's pretty powerful. Now that's the debugger, and let me show you that I was going to say, and I've got it on the presentation slide as well. Instead of intercepting the request, you might say, I don't want to do that. Well, you could instead trigger an email, and that email would send to you the details of all the variables, and it sends it in a format that is appropriate. I had an email open. I'm sorry, I don't have it open at the moment, but I don't think, I don't have the history readily available. Yeah, so in the interest of time, I won't show you that email, but you could look at that email and see the variables that were set. And it's smart so that if there's a, like a query with thousands of records, you only see the metadata about the query. You don't see every row in the query. If there's an array with thousands of elements, you see the first couple hundred characters of the array. You don't see the entire array. So the email won't be huge. But that's powerful because then you can set up the alert to just send you an email, set up the breakpoint to just send you an email. So anyway, that's a quick overview of the debugger. I just wanted to go over that. If you want to learn more about it, go check out these URLs, including these videos, which are on YouTube, and you can find them and look at them there as well. Just go to YouTube and search for FusionReactor debugger, and you'll find them. But there's plenty of documentation. Okay, and examples too, and more examples than I had time to get into. Now let me stop and talk about some questions people have asked. So Chris asks, when a breakpoint has exceeded the number of firings, can I re-enable? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, let me show you. Now that you see it's fired one time, watch what happens when I refresh this page. It just runs, and I get the error because that didn't change the code. It just changed the run of that request to change the value. So his point is, first of all, I wanted you to see that because it's no longer firing, it never intercepts it. And he said, can I re-enable it? Yes, you can. You just come in here, click this checkbox. And now the next time somebody runs the request, it gets intercepted. And if we come here, we see it is intercepted. And this also gives me a chance to show you that once it shows that it's intercepted, I could step through it and do all that stuff, or I could just say resume it. I can even say resume all. And there's a bunch of them here. You can just resume them all. All right, so there were some more questions. Which version is the debugger available on? Well, I'm not sure what, said which version of FusionReactor. That's still not quite clear. This is all FusionReactor 6 stuff. So remember, this presentation is stuff in FusionReactor 6. So it's not in 5, if that's what you meant. And it's in all versions of 6, if that's what you meant. Now, as far as licensing, I'll say again, it's only available in the Ultimate Edition. It's not in Standard or Enterprise. Okay? And that's it for the questions, so thank you for those. And there's just one more thing that's only in Ultimate, and it's also in Enterprise, and that's a new feature called System Resources. System Resources. So if I come over here and look at, if I scroll down here on the left, there's a new button, that you'll only see in Ultimate or Enterprise called System Resources. And the System Resources have several things in it, and this is a summary of them. Let me just focus on that for a moment. It shows me the total system resource utilization, not ColdFusion or FusionReactor or Lucy or Rilo or Tomcat's use of resources, the total system memory used. So I'm on a box right now that's using 4 gig of memory total. This is not the heap in ColdFusion or your CFML engine or Java engine. This is the total system memory utilization, and this is the total CPU use on the box, and this is disk I/O as it's tracked. And then there's some other nice information like how long has the server been up. Now, this can't be right because I know it didn't get restarted in 1969. I was only 7 and I wasn't working on servers then. So there seems to be a bug with this information, and I'm sure somebody's reported that and I just haven't had time to do it myself. But there's other information that you might be interested in seeing, and I'll leave you to look into that. And then there's breakdowns of these things into further details. So I could look at more details on the processes, more details on CPU, memory, disk, network. Okay, so that's that. I see some more questions. Okay, somebody asked regarding the debugger, can it be enabled to only show certain IP addresses? And the answer to that is no, there's no built-in feature that says limit the debugger to intercept requests only from certain IP addresses. But I wish I was in a classroom. I could ask you guys, or maybe one of you might throw in an answer. How, as a condition, could we do that? Well, if you stop to think about it, in CFML at least, there's a CGI variable called remote_ADDR, and that remote ADDR, you could do a variable, a condition that says CGI.remote_ADDR is, double quote, your IP address, and now it'll only intercept requests from your IP address, okay? So yes, you can do that, and I do discuss that in more detail in the videos. Then somebody says, if I've already licensed Enterprise, is it just entering a new license to activate debugging? Yes. So his question is, if he's already on FusionReactor Enterprise and he wants to go to Ultimate, yes. You just purchase that, and actually the way the new portal system works on FusionReactor 5 and 6, you would just, that would be updated in your portal, and the next time you came into FusionReactor, you would tell it to recheck the license. On the About page, there's a feature to check the license. So I go to FusionReactor About, in the top right corner there's a check license, and that would send a request out to their server. It would detect that you're now on Ultimate, and you would get it. That should be the way it would work. You shouldn't need a new key necessarily. You might get a new key, but you don't necessarily have to have one. And then finally, with a Lucy server that has multiple instances, is it possible to see the CPU and memory used per instance? Well, let's stop and clarify something. It doesn't really matter whether it's Lucy or ColdFusion. Multiple instances is what you're getting at. With FusionReactor, the interface you're looking at is only ever looking at one instance. So when we talk about like the metrics web metrics page, we're looking at the CPU and memory used of that instance, and there'd be a different FusionReactor interface for each instance, and you could often see choices to get to those. More importantly, and we don't have time in this presentation to get into it, but there's also the Enterprise Dashboard. The Enterprise Dashboard is a feature of FusionReactor Enterprise and above, and that would let you see multiple instances on one screen, and with that, yes, you could see the CPU and memory used per instance on one screen. That's the FusionReactor Enterprise Dashboard. Okay, so this has, your question is not really something that's answered by that new system resources. Remember, the system resources is per the whole system. Now, I will throw out there, in case it's maybe where you were going with the question, if we look at system resources processes, this is going to be a list of all the running processes, just like Task Manager in Windows or Top in Linux. And yes, you'd see each instance listed here, and you'd see its memory and CPU used. But let me throw out a caution. I didn't want to get into that here, but I do get into it elsewhere, and the docs do too. Since I'm running ColdFusion, in my case ColdFusion, as a limited user called CF user, I can only see other processes running as that user. If I were running ColdFusion as the local system account on Windows, then I'd see any processes, but I'm not, so I don't see any other processes. So if that's your situation, I'll just tell you that you wouldn't see, like other, in your case, Lucy instances, because if you start those as non-system users, they can't see details about each other. They can see their process ID, and that's it. But I'll go back and say what you really want in your case, Adam, is the Enterprise Dashboard. That's going to be the answer to your question. Okay, so that's system resources. I'll leave you to look into that. So the rest of the things I'm about to talk about are in all license editions of FusionReactor 6. unless I say otherwise. Now the next, and I think one of the most powerful things about FusionReactor 6, and a lot of people miss this, is up here on the top left under Requests, Applications. Requests, Applications. If you missed it, I'm going to do it one more time. Requests, Applications. And that takes me to a page that looks like some interesting graphs. You might go, I don't like graphs. Maybe you like data. Well, here's data. And you might look at this and go, well, what's that? Well, what it is I'm looking at one of many applications, and it just chose one by default. Don't know which one and why. But I could pick another one. Like I'll say I want to look at my blog application. And it's showing me what's going on in that blog. So here's my requests in that application with the graphs, and then more importantly down here with the text, showing me how many hits have happened against that application in the current time frame. Now, if you go back to the top and look, the current time frame by default is a minute. I could change it to 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. So let me just change it to an hour. And now I'm looking at, okay, during the last hour, what kind of requests have I had for this application? And what's been the biggest number? And I can sort it. And it sorts it by ascending order first, but that may be fixed in the future. But I'll make it by descending order. And now we can see that in the past hour, for that blog application, the greatest number of requests have been to this blog client rss.cfm. And that just is telling me now that though it's only 800 milliseconds on average in duration, it is running 72 times. And that might be worth attending to, perhaps even more than something that runs 2 times and takes 1.3 seconds. So sometimes people focus on the slowest requests, but sometimes it really makes sense to focus on what in aggregate may have been using the most resources. Okay, so that's a cool feature. And then you could even go back to the start of your instance, and that's, in my case, not really going to be, I think, any different, but it might in your application be different. Maybe what happened in the recent hour would be very different than what's happened since startup. And so there's been 37,000 requests for that rss.cfm. And one thing I'll just point out here, these IDs, squiggly IDs, those are a way that the engineers thought, hey, if there's numbers in these URLs, they may get to be too varied, and it might be too many variants. And so they've said if there's a number, we just take that out and hold the placeholder. It's like a regular expression placeholder for any number. In my case, these are the year, month, and day of the blog post, so it's not as really important in my case, but that's just the way it works by default. Now, I saw some questions coming in. Can this differentiate between requests on the same page with different URLs? Well, there you go. You can see. Oh, you mean query strings? No, I don't believe there's any support for variants by query string. Let me make note of that and look into it. I don't say that I can promise to get back to you specifically, but let me just look into it. It's the okay. So I don't think there's any provision for looking at things by query string, and I can see the value in that, but I don't believe it's there. Other questions? Right, he's explained an example of that, especially important for frameworks. Now I'll just say that there was support in, and is support in Fusion Analytics. Fusion Analytics has support for you to identify applications by query strings, but FusionReactor does not have that support. With the breakdown, I get 99% get of CFML servlet. Only after that individual page is an idea what that signifies. It's a framework 1 app. Well, I'm surprised you say get on a CFML servlet. So you literally see the phrase get on CFML servlet right there. Well, it is a Java, application, and maybe the way framework 1 works, it implements itself in a really low level so that you don't see the actual request. And I think this is probably similar to what Chris just asked, Chris Schmitz had asked about. You probably would also benefit from seeing the URL. So this is a place where unfortunately that won't help. And let me just say, I don't want to like hide or anything. At the end, I'm going to give you email addresses, and I'll just tell you right now, support@fusion-reactor.com. Support@fusion-reactor.com. Send an email to them asking about this. It may be something that they're working on. I haven't had anybody else ask me those, but they're great questions, and I'm surprised nobody has asked. And ask them. They've probably been asked, and they may already be working on it. There might be a unexposed, non-documented, UI element that you could turn on in a config file that maybe is going to be coming in the future. So anyway, ask them about that. I don't know the answer. Okay, we got to move on because we're not anywhere near done. Okay, good stuff. And you can learn more about that here. All right. Now, there's also, you may have noticed, a CF metrics and CF system metrics in the top left corner. Let me scroll back up to the top. Under metrics, we've always had metrics, web metrics, and custom series. Now we've got CF metrics and CF system metrics, and obviously these only apply to Cold Fusion, nothing for Lucy, or I don't believe there's any support for any equivalent to these in Lucy. You guys who are running Lucy right now, take a look and let me know, because I just hadn't paid attention to that. And the engineers would know, but I just personally haven't noticed it. So anyway, among the things you can see are things like the template cache size. In green, this is the template cache size. How large in memory is the template cache? And over here is how large in number is the template cache, how many things are in the template cache. And up here is how many things are in the query cache. And these are all potentially useful things. Now, some of these other things, like the server scope size, the app scope, the size of the query cache, system scopes, those are not turned on unless you are running Cold Fusion Enterprise and you've turned on the memory tracking feature of its server monitor. And most of you will know, if you've looked into that, that you don't generally want to turn on that feature. So unfortunately, this really won't be useful for most of you. But the template cache is there for everybody, because Cold Fusion always tracks that size for you. And also, if you turn on their start monitoring feature, you'll get some things like hit ratios and threads running and queue size and things like that. Now, this user count, finally, this is about who uses CF login in your code, CF login. And somebody's answered that the CF metrics are not available in any instance monitoring Lucy. And again, I wouldn't have expected to say CF metrics, but I wondered if it might have said Lucy metrics, but it doesn't. And it might be that there is no equivalent to these metrics that are exposed by Lucy, or it may be that they're coming and the engineers will add it. So again, if you're interested in that, send an email to support@fusion-reactor.com asking if and when the equivalent to these metrics will be offered in Lucy. There's also a CF metrics, and that too really doesn't have much in it, and it tells you up there unless you turn on monitoring in Cold Fusion Enterprise, and in particular, mostly you have to turn on the start monitoring feature to get most of these populated. But everybody in FusionReactor, in Cold Fusion, and perhaps also in Lucy, tell me, can see DB pool stats. And this is going to be interesting. Some people are very interested in their data sources and how many connections are open on average and total. Another question, do you know if the CF server monitor is still such a big problem in CF 2016? Yes, it is. There's no difference with the monitor since CF 8. It really hasn't changed. Now, let me be clear so that nobody misconstrues what I said. You can open the CF monitor. There's no impact. You can turn on start monitoring in the CF monitor. There's no impact. But the impact for most people is if they turn on start memory tracking in the monitor. That will hurt most people. Not everybody, though. Some people open it and turn that on and don't have an impact. So anyway, this isn't the place to get into that in any more detail than that. We'll leave it at that. Let's move on. So there you go. Check those things out. And again, all this information is on the screen so that you can look at the slides later and be reminded what we talked about. I'm skipping over it in the interest of time. So that's a leftover. You can ignore that. Okay. Now, also in FusionReactor 6, memory is now tracked per request and per query and per transaction. Yes, it is. So check this out. If I come up here to requests history, or request slow request, or request longest request, all of them, I can go to the history and look at the details of a given request. I'll just pick one randomly. And in here, at the bottom, this is new. You've always had these there, and you may have thought that they referred to the memory used by the request, but this was memory used by the engine at the time of the request. But this is memory used by the request down here at the bottom. This used 400K, 400,000 bytes, 400K. Okay, so that's in every request. And also, if you look at jdbc, and I'll pick, just for variety, I'll pick jdbc slow transactions. So these are the most recent queries that were slower than 3 seconds by default. And I'll pick one of these and look at the details and scroll down, and it used 343K for this particular query. So that's this query brought back 343K worth of data. Pretty cool stuff, right? And it gets even better if I look at requests by memory. This is the 100 most memory consuming requests since Cold Fusion came up, in descending order by size. Now these are in bytes, remember, so this looks like it's 900K, 800 meg, 1.8 gig, and you might go, wow, that really took 1.8 gig? And what I'll say is beware, this is reflecting how much memory it used during its life total, but that doesn't mean that any one point it was using 1.8 gig, because the JVM could have been doing garbage collection in the middle, and it may not have been holding all its objects for its whole life. So I just want to clarify, don't presume that this means that when this ran, you needed to have 1.8 gig. You might look at something and see that it's 3 gig and you've got only 2 gig in the heap. Again, this is over the life of the request, so I don't want to get into much detail here, but just be aware of that. Okay, so that's cool. And then by transaction as well, and if you look at transactions, there's different kinds of transactions. So if I look at, say, slow transactions, in the top right corner, I can pick what kind of transactions, and the default is web request. I can also look at JDBC requests, but look, and I can also look at HTTP client. So now I'm looking at what requests, like how much memory did this particular CF-HTTP call take. That would be in the details of this particular CF-HTTP call, and it took 144 meg. And those may be to something off the server. These are CF-HTTP calls, like there's a call to feed squirrel that I do, and if I wondered how much memory does that call to the feed squirrel URL take, again, it's 144 meg. So I'll leave you to explore that on your own. Okay. Okay, and I got those warnings that I just shared with you, and there's a whole article talking about it. There's also some improvements to the stack trace page. You'd seen me do a stack trace earlier. I'll do it one more time. I'll kick this guy off and watch him running. Under requests, activity, and do the stack trace. And it's just a little bit improved in some ways, some of the information on the left. Also, let me just tell you that if you're using the ultimate version, notice when I mouse over this, it's got a hyperlink in it. If I were to click on that, it'll create a breakpoint in the debugger at that line of code. Just automatically fills in a breakpoint for that line of code. So again, that's in the stack trace. I can do that. By the way, this reminded me of something I didn't say earlier. You can also set the breakpoints to break on a condition, on an exception. And for that reason, let me also tell you that some of you may know that if you look at requests response codes, this has been here forever, you can look at what requests had errors. So I'm waiting for the list to come up. And again, that slowness is just some quirk on my server. Usually it's instant. I work with people on lots and lots of servers, and it's never slow. So I just think there's some quirk where when I click on things, it's not really clicking that link. I don't see the browser looking like it's doing the lookup. There you go. It finally came back up. Anyway, I can look up here under status codes and say, show me what requests had errors. What request had 500 errors? Yeah, see, it's somehow backed up looking at a request from before that I stack traced. So again, I apologize for this quirkiness. It's something going on the server. So when I look at my 500 errors, here's a request that had an error, and if I click on this link, I'll be shown the request, and you may know it's not new in 6, it's always been there in 5 even. If I go to error details, it shows me what error happened. So this line of code did a query that had an error. Well, I can also set up breakpoints on error conditions. So I could take this and create a breakpoint on that particular error condition, or I could also just tell it to set up a breakpoint on any error condition. So again, those are nice features of the debugger. Okay, moving on. We've got about 15 minutes left. Tried to answer your questions as we go, so it slowed us down just a little bit, but that's okay. There's also a Relations tab on request details. So let me go back to like the requests, slow requests, and let me look for one that may have done some HTTP processing. Well, I'll just pick one random. I didn't have a good example set up, so I'll look at this one. So I'm looking at the details of a particular request, and in that particular request, in a moment, we're going to see up at the top of the screen the details like you normally would. And again, I just feel like my browser is not honoring my clicks. It's not slowness of the server. It's really fast. We saw that earlier on web metrics. So here's the details. Well, what I want you to see is I can go to this Relations tab, and this tracks if there have been queries, when did they happen, and how long did they take. And if I were to look at a page that did a CF-HTTP, I'd see the CF-HTTP and when it happened and how long it took within that request. And then it gives a breakdown of, there were 38 queries. It took an average of 2 seconds and a total of 10 seconds. That's all nice new stuff in this aggregation page. Or relations, sorry, the Relations tab. And there is a new Aggregates tab also. I can't remember where I saw that. Sorry for just momentary forgetfulness there, but there is an Aggregates also that you might want to look at times. And check this out. You can see aggregate totals of CF-HTTP or HTTP client calls under transactions, external sources. So again, this is focusing on calls made out of the server to another server. And it too breaks it down by what server got called. Remember I said I knew I had calls to like feed squirrel. So there I could look at what calls were made to feed squirrel in the past hour. And it's refreshing immediately, so there's none. So if I change it to since start, obviously there were some since start. That's why it's in that list, and there they are, and it looks like there was just one. But anyway, if there were more than one, I would see how many there were and how long they took on average. So it's aggregating the HTTP calls, which can be really helpful because sometimes that's an issue. CF-HTTP calls or HTTP client calls in Java coming out of your server to another server, making things slow. All right, trying to wrap up. There's new weekly and monthly reports, and I'll just leave you to look into those, really valuable. There's been daily reports since 6. I'll leave you to look into that in more detail. You can export logs from the archive. This is important for some people. If you come down here to logging, log archive, and you see a zip here from a few hours ago, and you think, man, I wish I could look at that. Well, when you clicked on this, it would offer you the option to download it. That's not enabled by default in FusionReactor 5. It was available as a certain XML element if you thought to click it to configure it or found the docs for it. But in 6, it's automatically enabled by default. And I think it's as a particular release like 6.2. Sorry, I don't have that detail. So on the latest version, for sure, you'll find that when you look at these archives, you click on it, it'll download it, which is really nice. And there's some changes in the style of the alerts. They're just much more well formatted and tabular. I'll leave you to look at those on your own. They show what queries are running up at the top and the request thread ideas at the top. It's all really good stuff, really good improvements. And then some hidden gems. I just wanted to highlight a few things. Sessions are moved to user sessions. They're not under metrics custom series anymore. And there is some improvement in those. If we look at my sessions under user sessions, it's nice. It has a graph tracking how many there are in the current live time frame of a few minutes. I can look back over like an hour or a day, and I'll say let's show it during the day. So here's my sessions throughout the day, the total, and then up here is them being created and destroyed. And they're pretty quickly being created and destroyed, so it's not as useful when you go out to the day view where it averages things over hours. But here's the live view, and we can see a session being created there, session being destroyed there. And then down here there's even totals, and you can get it broken down by application, and you can move things up to this list by clicking plus track. If you click untrack, it goes down to this bottom list. It just shows a little more detail for the ones that are tracked, broken down by seconds, minutes, and hours of creating and destroyed. All right, so that's cool stuff. And there's graphs. When you're on the pages that have graphs, like if I go to requests time graph, I want you to see this, those who use this graph a lot. You may have noticed, well, I'd like to go to the request activity graph, and maybe I want to set this to be looking at the last day. And when you switched and went up to request activity, A, you had to scroll up to get to it. B, it would go back to looking at the live view. Well, now you can just click this activity button, and it switches between the activity graph and the time graph. It's still, oh no, it didn't. Sorry, I thought it would keep the day view. But anyway, it is at least easier to toggle back and forth between the time view and the activity view, and I would argue that that's a bug, an opportunity for improvement. I see a couple of questions that have come in. Let me look at those. Does this track CF scheduler calls as well? They're HTTP calls, if I remember correctly. Well, the difference is, he's asking about that stuff that was looking at transactions. This FusionReactor is looking at CF HTTP calls from within CFML code. Your point about the fact that scheduled tasks are like CF HTTP calls, that's true, but they're from Cold Fusion. So really, FusionReactor just sees scheduled tasks as any other request. So to be clear, no, there's no specific handling of scheduled tasks in a unique way. They are just like any other request. I think it's a question. Is it possible to put an alert on response code? No. Now let's say quickly, FusionReactor doesn't have any alerts other than running requests, timeout, long-running requests, and memory reaching a certain amount. Those are the only alerts that FusionReactor currently has. But those of you who were maybe at CF Camp or CF Summit in the last month, we've had those two conferences, there's a new thing coming out that was previewed there called FusionReactor in the Cloud. And FusionReactor in the Cloud has a much more powerful alerting mechanism. And I don't have time to get into the cloud here. When it comes out, we'll do a webinar on that. But the cloud has much more powerful alerts. And yes, you could set up alerts for things, I think, even about error code. So you get an email when an error happened. But let's just back up and say, Cold Fusion and CFML in general, and any application server, has always had error handling. And usually it would be on you to set up error handling to say if an error occurs, send me an email. But maybe there would be provision in the cloud alerting mechanism to send you an email with some information about 500 errors. And I'm going to leave you, Chris, to email support to find out more about that. Ram asked how to set up monthly reports. Well, there's no setup required. If you configure the FusionReactor settings, let me make sure you're paying attention, FusionReactor settings, the very first thing that comes up is the email configuration information. And you would have configured that, I'm waiting for it to come up, you would have configured that to get alerts, for instance, but as soon as you configure that, again, I don't know why it's being slow, this is not a FusionReactor thing, there's some combination of factors, but if you configure that, then you will get the daily reports, and if you're on Enterprise or Ultimate, you'll get the weekly and monthly reports. Okay? Is there a limit on how old the logs can be in that archive? Well, again, that's another whole subject. That's a built-in feature, been in FusionReactor forever, and down here under logging settings, you can control the log rotation, how they get logged, how they get managed, what the rotation is, what the archival is, how long they get kept. That's all traditional stuff, nothing new in FusionReactor 6. Does user experience still require JavaScript snippet in each page? Yes, Chris, it does. In the history request, is there a means of applying a search filter? No, there is not. Again, send a request to support asking for that. I agree that that could be valuable. There's a tail feature. So maybe you don't even know that you can look at the logs, but if you come up here to FusionReactor logs, that's different than what we looked at a moment ago. That was logging archive. This is FusionReactor logs. This interface lets you look at any of the logs currently being written, but not all of the log. Like if I look at the request log, I probably won't see it going back very far at all, right? It only goes back, I'm on US Central Time, although, yeah, so it's 9:54, so I only see about 30 minutes worth of requests because the logs are set up to only show about 128K of data by default. This interface is keeping this information in memory, and that's why it's got to keep it from being too much information. But the point is, they did add in FusionReactor 6 a new tail feature. So if I click on this, now it's going to jump to the bottom, and every time a request happens, I'm going to see that log update as a request comes in, tracking the start or end of any request. And there we can see them happening. So that's cool. So there's a tail feature in the log viewer, but not the archive feature. That's a different thing. That's for downloading the archives of previous hours. This is about looking at the currently written logs for the current hour. I mentioned the debugger can send emails. Matt, I talked about that. I mentioned this as well, so I would have gotten it later. Sorry, I didn't remember that I put this in later. There is a new feature. Check this out. Many of you are going to be interested in this. There's a new feature to track CFML line execution time. So how much time is spent on every request. It was an option in 604 for Cold Fusion, and it's an option as of 6.2 for Lucy and Rilo. It's a line performance profiler, tracking the execution and duration of every line. Now, the thing is that it can have high performance impact, so it is disabled by default, but you would enable it by going to the plugins, active plugins, and find that line execution plugin. But just beware, when you enable it, there is impact. So use it and then turn it off. And there's a tool to view its saved result, and that's at GitHub. Now I'll say one more time in case you guys have not been paying attention. These slides will be emailed to you. So this URL will be in the slides when it's sent to you. So don't worry about getting it right now. But yes, there is a tool that you can turn on and use it as a code coverage tool even. So check that out. Pretty interesting. And there's more discussion about it in the docs at this page. And again, just wait till you get the slides to get that. Or you can go into the docs and do a search for line performance profiler, and you'll find it. And again, it's available for both Cold Fusion and FusionReactor, Cold Fusion and Lucy and Rilo. And then wrapping up, there's an option to obfuscate SQL in the URL to hide customer data as shown when the SQL is displayed. That's under jdbc settings, transaction settings. And it only affects the UI, not the logs. There's an option to generate jdbc SQL explain information from the database server for very slow queries, and that's under jdbc settings, query plan settings. It asks the database server to send back the query plan if it would, and most databases will, and FusionReactor would show it. And you can customize the reports in many ways, setting different emails to get the reports versus getting the alerts. And I'll just tell you, especially Ram, since you were interested in this, look at FusionReactor plugins at the information about the FusionReactor reports config plugin. Okay. You can stop profiling of a request if you really wanted to. There's a button on the right when you're looking at running a request. You can just say stop profiling if you want to. You can also change when the profiler triggers. It does it by default at 3 seconds of execution time. You can change the polling interval, which defaults again to 200 milliseconds in this plugin. You can change that information. And just lastly, you can, FusionReactor, when you turn on a crash protection alert and you untrack a request, it will not count untracked requests that are, when you use the feature that's not new called untracked requests, they will affect whether you get the CP alert. So I'm sorry that's a little brief and not clear. I'll just leave you to look into this more. Here's the document, the setting for that. And there's a notification center it's got improvements and there's support for Spring and struts. So there's lots more we could talk about. Really, that's as much as I knew we could fit in this time frame, so we're out of time. In conclusion, I just want to remind you, that I was trying to give you a lot of information. Did you learn a lot? And you can answer that with this poll I'm going to show you right now. You can rate the session, let me know how valuable you felt the information was in both the content and the way it was presented. So did you learn a lot? Will it be valuable? Did you learn too much or too little? Was it not valuable? Or was it a total waste of your time? I'm going to give you several seconds, and while you do that, I'll look and see if there were any other questions that I hadn't answered. No. Okay, great. And so anybody that rated it, as okay or less, there's 1 or 2 people who said okay. We'd love to hear your feedback. What do you think could be improved? What did I not do to meet your satisfaction? We'd love to hear from you. Send an email to sales. In fact, let me just tell you that. I'll go ahead and close the poll now. Everybody has answered, or most have answered. So remember, you'll get the link to the recording, and we'll be repeating this one as well as the other one. And we do welcome your feedback, or on other sessions you might want to see. And we've got some planned coming out in the future. But you can send feedback or questions about the webinar to sales@fusion-reactor.com. Again, if you had questions that were related to technical matters, send those to support@fusion-reactor.com. The guys are great, and they would look forward to your feedback. And with that, boom, we're right on the money, just about to end. So let me just look and see if there were any further questions that came in. I saw it. Okay, good. Thank you. Good deal. Okay, good. Any other remaining questions before we go? And if not, then I'll just say thank you. Thanks to those who are saying thank you. I appreciate you coming. Hope it was valuable. Look forward to your feedback and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And go enjoy Fusion Reactor 6. Lots of cool stuff to go play with. And you can watch the recording again shortly when you get the email with that link. So let me go ahead and stop that recording now.